Hello, everybody. We are coming in a little belated this week for our weekly video. I was going to do this yesterday, but then some stuff came up yesterday afternoon that kind of blocked it, and by the time all was said and done, I kind of came to the conclusion of, I'll just wait till tomorrow. So we are coming in for this week's video, and I have decided that next week we will not be doing a video because it is the week of leading into Christmas Eve and Christmas Eve. Well, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So I've kind of decided that I'm just going to not do a video next week because I am anticipating that it's going to be quite busy for me. I'm sure it will be quite busy for most people. So for next week, we will not have a video. I will resume the videos after Christmas. So the week that is Christmas, but later in that week, we're probably around the 28th, 29th probably of December, will be one of our last videos of the year. So as for today's video, we are doing I just want to do mostly a fill-in video for this week. I've got definitely some different ideas I want to go for. But as for this week, for just getting a video done, I felt just do something work on something that we've already been working on a little bit. So today we're going to do one of our president's videos. We haven't done one in well over a year. I mean, we're not making this a regular right now, but I wanted to go ahead and this was a topic that came, well, it's an easy thing. It's got to be covered. No, we're working on it. So for a filler in, it works perfectly. So the last time we had done a president video, which I believe was back last year. Yes, last year, I believe. The last time we had done one, we left off with number 16, of course, my personal favorite president and the one that I admire the most, and that was Abraham Lincoln, and probably also the one of the two presidents that most Americans know right off the bat. They know George Washington, they know Abraham Lincoln. They don't know so much of the others unless it's the current, maybe around the current presidents, like Obama, Bush, Clinton, Trump, Biden, all that stuff. But other than that, most people don't know their presidents that well, and I've definitely observed that. So, what we're moving on for today's president video is we're looking at the 17th president of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And this is Andrew Johnson. I actually had to dig this up, it had been buried. And Andrew Johnson was one of those presidents where he was not elected president. He became president upon the death of the predecessor of office, which in this case was, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And Johnson is going to be a very peculiar case, as we're going to see, because in terms of what he did, he is perhaps one of the worst presidents the United States has had. I mean, we've had plenty of bad presidents. Johnson takes the cake among most of them, and he's definitely in that top tier worst list on any presidential historian or history wrangle, whatever it may be. He's definitely not a good example of what the presidential office can be, and we'll see that here very shortly. So, as we usually go through these videos, we go through mostly, it's like a biography of sorts. We try to summarize a little bit of the events of their life. We will hit what they did early on. We will go through the events of their presidency or leading up to that presidency. And then if we'll also go through any relevant information that may pertain to after they left office, what happened to them until their death date. So in the case of Andrew Johnson, he is going to be born on December 29th of 1808 in a log cabin near Raleigh, North Carolina. He was a Southern man at heart. He was a Southern man for life. Andrew Johnson, he was born in North Carolina, and then the rest of his life, he pretty much lived in Tennessee. He was a Southern man. And you might think right now, well, wait a minute, he succeeded Lincoln, but yet the Civil War was between the North and the South. So how did a Southern man get to be vice president of the United States? We will get to that. Andrew's father had been Jacob Johnson, who had been a porter at an inn. Unfortunately, Andrew never really got to meet his father, as his father had died when Andrew was only 3 years old. His mother, Mary, or Polly, as some of her family members called her, Mary McDonough Johnson, was a laundress and a seamstress, and Johnson grew up poor and he never attended schooling. He was in poverty throughout most of his childhood. His family never knew wealth. They weren't even classified as middle class. I don't even know if you could classify them as poor. I mean, they had literally almost nothing. And in that respect, he has something in common with Abraham Lincoln there a little bit as well, where Lincoln was also born into poverty, where Lincoln's father could neither read nor write. He couldn't even write his own name. And there's a similarity there. I think that might be part of the reason why these two men might have also gotten along a little bit, is that they came from very similar backgrounds, and both of them grew up in poverty. Now, Johnson, at a very young age, he was apprenticed as a tailor in his late teens, and this would eventually become his starting career, because in 1826, when Johnson would have been 18 years old, he ended up moving to Greenville, Tennessee, which is in eastern Tennessee. I think it's almost near the North Carolina border, I believe. It's just east of Knoxville, if I'm not wrong. I could be wrong on that. But he moved to Greenville in eastern Tennessee, and he became a tailor. That was his starting out business that he decided to start doing on his own as soon as he got out on his own. A year later, in 1827, he married Eliza McCurdle, who was the daughter of a local shoemaker. The couple would end up having 5 children, and Eliza kind of helped Andrew with some of the liabilities that had come with poverty, and being that he had never at any time attended schooling because his family could not afford it at the time. Mind you, public education did not really exist back then. It was if you could afford to send your children to school, or you would tutor them at home. And in this case, Andrew had grown up. He didn't know how to read. He didn't know how to write. I mean, he might have known a little bit, but it wasn't much. And once he marries Eliza, Eliza actually helped Andrew to improve his reading and writing skills, and she actually personally tutored her husband in mathematics so that he could gain on that end of the field as well. So, through his marriage to Eliza, not only does he gain 5 children, but Andrew also manages to gain a mild, moderate education compared to what he had had previously. Johnson would eventually become prosperous enough in Greenville to buy property there, and he acquired several slaves to work in his home. So he goes from poverty to now he's got his own property. He owns his own land, he owns his own house. He's even got enough money to own some slaves. I mean, this is the southern United States prior to the Civil War, so slavery is legal back then. And that's also why I'm sure Johnson gets a little bit of bad rep from modern people. And I'm not saying that he don't deserve that, but we also have to keep in mind it was it was a product of the times, and it was a context of the times. So, when does Andrew enter politics? Andrew starts entering politics or around 1829. He begins his political career as he becomes elected alderman in Greenville. This coincides with the same time with the election of Andrew Jackson, who is both a Democrat like Johnson, and Jackson is also ironically from Tennessee. And in 1829, when Johnson becomes elected alderman of Greenville, Tennessee, Jackson is elected president as the 7th president of the United States. And Johnson shared Jackson's view of himself as a champion of the common man. On this point, he really kind of connected with the Jacksonian Democrats of the time, where before Andrew Jackson had come to the presidency, there was the common conception that the presidents who had come before served the wealthy. You had people that came from very prestigious families from the Revolutionary War period. You had George Washington, of course, who I'm not going to say anyone really would have chastised Washington, but then you had John Adams, who was very well to do off. You had Thomas Jefferson, who was also very well to do off. You had James Madison, the father of the Constitution. James Monroe, you could argue, but he did come from the elite planter class of Virginia. And then you had John Quincy Adams, who was Jackson's predecessor, who had been the son of John Adams, and thus had also had a little bit of a prestigious political career beforehand, such as Secretary of State. Jackson argued that he was a defender of the common man. He'd grown up on the frontier in the backwaters of South Carolina. He was a common man at heart. He wasn't a really wealthy man that he really catered to wealth interests. And Johnson shares this same sentiment. And this is why I think Johnson had always kind of maintained his political allegiance to the Democrats even after the Civil War. Like Jackson, Johnson resented the rich aristocratic planters, and he favored states' rights and populist policies. Now, while he did favor states' rights, he wasn't exactly Johnson, like Jackson, also drew a line where states' rights could be applied, and that would come to the secession issue that we'll see here in a little bit. Now, using his excellent oratorical skills, Johnson actually became mayor of Greenville in 1834, and then he was elected to the Tennessee legislature in 1835 as a state representative. Johnson remained in the legislature until 1843, when then he was then voted as one of the Tennessee representatives into the U.S. House of Representatives, into Congress. So in 1843, Johnson makes the leap from state to national, and in 1835 he had been in state. So 1835 to 1843, Johnson is on the state level in Tennessee as a representative in the Tennessee legislature. And then in 1843, he goes to the U.S. House of Representatives as a representative for Tennessee. Now, during his time in Congress, Johnson introduced what would later become the Homestead Act, and some people might be familiar with this and others may not. The Homestead Act granted tracts of land, undeveloped public land, to settlers basically for free, as long as the settlers came and agreed that they would settle it and farm it and develop that land. The government was basically giving out land for free almost out in the West. And this act, it didn't pass immediately. Johnson, mind you, this is the 1840s, and for people that are aware of this act, you would know well that the Homestead Act didn't officially become law until 1862. So roughly 20 years later, it was really modified a whole lot as it came down the line and switched a little bit in certain parts. So it took a while for this to actually become an actual law, but later down the road it did, and thus we can also attribute Johnson to having some success with that because he was one of the original sponsors of the bill during his early days in Congress. Now, as the slavery debate ramped up in the 1840s, Congress was split over whether slavery should be expanded to the new territories. Now, to us that are well aware of American history at this point and stage of the 1840s, 1850s, we know this. We know that the divide over slavery, it wasn't merely an ideological thing. I mean, this thing was getting into physical confrontations, not just between the states and their governments, but into the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, into the presidency, presidential elections. The whole debate over slavery was everywhere at the time. It was something that was rapidly growing up because you had the North that maintained that slavery was immoral, that it was not right, and that it should be abolished. And then you had the South that very much depended upon African American labor for its cotton crop, which was its main cash source, and they didn't really have the industrialization of the North. And the South argued, well, we're not going to give up our way of life, because if we give up all we don't like you guys, we don't believe that blacks are equal. And mind you, that wasn't just a Southern thing; that was everywhere thing. It was much more prevalent in the South, I think, but the North was just as racist as the South was toward blacks. The difference came that the South was not willing to give up the slavery aspect, because they argued, well, if we give up the slaves, there goes our economy. There goes our money. There goes our whole influence within the Union. And in the 1840s, this really starts to amp up, especially after the Mexican-American War that saw the acquisition of most of the modern-day American West states, such as California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. Their question is now coming around as to whether or not will slavery be allowed in these new territories as new states are carved up from them. Johnson believed that the Constitution protected the rights of individuals to own slaves, and that the government really couldn't do anything to prevent the spread of slavery, and that if it did try to do so, it would technically be an unconstitutional measure. In 1853, Johnson left Congress to become governor of Tennessee. So in 1853, so 10 years in Congress, and then Johnson decides, you know what, I'm going to go back to my home state, and I'm going to become governor. In 1850, but he was only governor for 4 years, because in 1857 he vacated the governorship for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Last time he was in Congress, Johnson was a member in the House. He wasn't in the Senate. In 1857, he gives up his governor's seat and he goes ahead and runs for Tennessee senator, and he ends up getting one of the two positions that opened. Now, despite the growing calls for secession in Tennessee, Johnson advocated for preserving the Union. He did argue that states' rights should protect slave owners' property, but he also argued that this isn't worth tearing the Union apart over. We can work out something on this that will benefit both parties. And that's kind of odd for Johnson because many Southern senators at this point are becoming very radicalized. They're becoming very fiery in their remarks toward abolitionists. And they're very much dead dog determined that if the federal government does anything that they view as detrimental to their economies, to their way of life, to the slavery system that exists, they will secede and break away from the United States because they claim that the government is no longer listening to them. So that brings us up to around 1860 with the coming of the Civil War. Now, the American Civil War, just a refresher for those of you who may not know, this American Civil War would begin on April 12th of 1861 when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, and that before the fort had been bombarded by Confederate forces, you had, I believe, 7 Confederate states that had already broken away, mostly the Deep South states. So you had Florida, South Carolina was first. You had South Carolina, Mississippi. I'm trying to think how they go in order here. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas had all broken away by February of 1861 in opposition to the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860, who they believed would abolish slavery. Now, may I remind you, Lincoln never at one time during his campaign stated that his main goal upon taking office was to abolish slavery. He had stated multiple times over that he was merely opposed to its expansion and that he would not interfere with it where it already existed. The southern states, in their fanaticism and their misguided misguided reasoning and all logic, decided that that meant he was going to get rid of the slaves, even though that he had never said that. And they tried, of course, to have painted it as other things like, oh, this is states' rights and everything else. Well, no, it was not. I mean, back in the day, there were even Confederate politicians, such as the Confederate vice president, who literally admitted the foundation of the Confederate Constitution and its whole regime was on the backs of slaves, was on the prospect that the African American, I'm saying the nicer term here, and not the term that they would have used, but the African American man or woman was not equal to the white man or woman. And it was founded upon that very principle, as he put it. And the Confederacy ends up in April of 1861. They fire on a federal fort that would not surrender to rebel forces, that would not surrender its jurisdiction. The Confederates argued that since it was now within a state that had seceded from the Union and was supposedly no longer part of the United States, that that fort had to be vacated. The federal government says, no, we don't recognize you as having seceded. That is not constitutional for you to do, so this is still federal property. And on April 12th, they ended up bombarding it. A day or two later, Fort Sumter had fallen. After Fort Sumter is bombarded, Lincoln ended up putting a call out for, I can't remember how many volunteers he had here. Let me look it up real quick. Let me see how many volunteers that Lincoln called for after the attack on Fort Sumter. I just want to make sure. It was a call for 75,000. 75,000 volunteers were called for after the attack on Fort Sumter. And Lincoln, upon calling for these, ended up pushing 4 other southern states into seceding. Virginia ended up pushing. Virginia ended up joining the Confederacy. Arkansas ended up joining the Confederacy. North Carolina ended up joining the Confederacy. And then in June of 1861, the last state to join the Confederacy was Johnson's own state of Tennessee. Tennessee did secede from the Union. In June of 1861, the Tennessee voters approved a referendum to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Johnson had traveled actually across Tennessee leading up to this referendum, and he had been speaking against secession and urging them to stay within the Union and remain loyal to it, even after his state had seceded, even after Tennessee had decided that we're going out and we're joining the rest of the South. Johnson remained loyal to the North. He would not budge, which made him kind of a very peculiar figure because he was the only Southern senator to remain in Congress upon the secession of these 11 rebel states. I mean, Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland could also be classified as Southern, but they didn't secede. Confederacy claimed otherwise, but they never truly did. But of all the 11 Southern states that had seceded, Johnson was the only one of those 22 senators that ended up staying in Congress. In 1862, he ended up resigning from the Senate and accepted President Lincoln's appointment of him as Tennessee's military governor, as by 1862, the Union armies are rapidly reoccupying most of Tennessee and trying to reassert federal control. So Lincoln sees a prime opportunity here. I have a very well-known Tennessee senator who has not deviated from the Union. He's still very loyal to the federal government, and he would be and he's also served as governor of the state before. He's been involved in local politics. He'd be the perfect figure to act as a military governor to reestablish federal authority within the state and to try to handle, any humanitarian problems or what might come up that the occupying Union forces might have to deal with there, because he knows the people, he knows the population, he knows the state well. And Johnson ends up accepting this appointment as Tennessee's military governor during the war, trying to reestablish federal authority in Tennessee. Before we go further here, I've got a couple pictures I think we're going to show, if I can find them. Yes, we do. I think right down here is one. All right, so this is Andrew Johnson right at around the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. I think this is an 1860 photograph of him. He looks a little younger here. His hair is more trimmed, definitely. So this is him at the outbreak of the Civil War. This is his wife, Eliza McCurdle, who he married back in 1827. And he had 5 children. She had been the one that kind of taught him how to read and write, had kind of tutored him in mathematics to try to get his education up. That is her. Of course, she would end up being our first lady as well. And this is Johnson's house in Greenville, Tennessee today. But it's still there. I think it's like a historical home, but it's still standing there today in Greenville. All right. So that brings us up to the vice presidency. Now, Lincoln in 1864, while the Civil War is coming down to its closing event hours, because 1864, the tide is turned against the South. It's evident the North will win. It's just a matter of when. And seeking re-election in November of 1864, Lincoln asked his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, to step down. Now, Hannibal Hamlin was from Maine, and he had been a perfectly fine vice president for the first 4 years of Lincoln's term of office. There was nothing wrong with Hannibal Hamlin as a man. He wasn't a corrupt dude. Instead, Lincoln chose Johnson as his running mate for his second term bid, as a symbol of unity. Since Johnson had Southern ties, Johnson was the only Southern senator to remain loyal, and if I include Johnson on the ticket, then it would definitely convey this image that Southerners were wrong to leave the Union, because right here, if we really wanted to exclude you from government, would I nominate a Southern man to be my vice president and be my second in command, pretty much? Lincoln, and he knew the war was coming to an end. He didn't want to have Southerners feel that, you're being entirely excluded from the Reconstruction process that's sure to come afterwards. He wanted to make them feel that you are still being included in this government. We still are one country. And just because you guys rebel does not mean that we will not treat you as Americans. So, as a symbol of unity, Lincoln had done this. He had asked Hannibal Hamlin to step down and allow Johnson and named Johnson onto his 1864 reelection ticket. The Lincoln-Johnson ticket ended up winning the November 1864 election against Democrat George McClellan, a former military general who Lincoln had fired due to his inactivity. And the final electoral college vote was 212 votes to 20 McClellan's 21, and 55% of the popular vote. Johnson ended up being sworn in as vice president on the same day as Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term on March 4th of 1865. Unfortunately, this is where we see a little bit of Johnson not having the best judgment when it came to a public event. And the night before the inauguration, Johnson had drank whiskey beforehand as he believed it was helping him recover from typhoid fever that he had about a month earlier. Unfortunately, he got drunk that night, and by the next day, he was still hungover and still drunk as a skunk. So here is the vice president elect doing at the inauguration on March 4th of 1865, and Johnson ends up, during his inaugural speech, he ends up slurring his words multiple times, leading to the belief that he was an alcoholic. This did not look well to people, to have the vice president slurring his words at his inaugural speech because he was simply drunk. The war effectively ended roughly just a couple weeks later, about a month later, on April 9th, when Robert E. Lee, the General Lee, he ended up surrendering at Appomattox, Virginia. So about a month after Johnson comes into office as vice president, him and Lincoln see the end of the war on April 9th, pretty much, because after Lee, I mean, there were some other Confederate Army surrenders, but at that point, the Confederate capital had been taken. Lee was the largest and most dangerous army in the field, and now he had given up. There was basically just mopping up what little resistance there was left at that point. The war was over at that definitive point. However, on just a few days later, I think, well, how many would it have been here? Just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater by assassin John Wilkes Booth, as we all know, which was in Washington, D.C., and Lincoln ended up dying the next morning. Johnson was sworn in upon Lincoln's death as president at his hotel where he had been staying by Chief Justice Salmon Chase. But, however, what most people don't realize is that the night of Lincoln's assassination, Johnson had actually been part of the assassination plot that Booth had kind of come up with his colleagues. Booth had planned to basically decapitate the entire head of the United States government by assassinating Lincoln, by assassinating Vice President Johnson, by assassinating Secretary of State William Seward, and by, if he got the chance, by assassinating General Ulysses S. Grant. Unfortunately, Grant ended up being taken off the list because he was not in Washington at the time. Seward, an attack was made on Seward. One of his co-conspirators, Lewis Powell, or I remember how they pronounce his name. I believe that was his name. He ended up busting into Seward's home. Seward had been bedridden for the past couple of weeks because of a carriage accident that he had had, and thus his son tried to stop this assassin from coming into the bedroom, but Powell ended up grabbing his large Bowie knife and ended up gouging his son right in the arm, and then went and attacked Seward, and Seward barely ended up living. He did eventually recover, but he had scars for the rest of his life. So Seward did get attacked, but they failed to kill him. And Lincoln did get attacked and got killed. And the co-conspirator that had been assigned to Johnson to go and basically kill him, had been George Atzerodt. And Atzerodt had kind of been nervous about the whole plot in the first place. He had never really been 100% on board with what Booth and the others were planning. So he did go to the hotel, but then he kind of lost his nerves and he went to a bar that was nearby. And by the time he was done at the bar, he came back to the hotel and he just gave up. He walked out, never even tried to kill Johnson at all. Now, he later was found out to be a conspirator that had been planning to do it, and he was still hanged for having been a member of the assassination plot. But if it had not been for Atzerodt just not having the guts to do it, I mean, Johnson could very well have died here as well on the night of April 14th of 1865. So that brings us, at this point, with Lincoln's death and Johnson being sworn in, Johnson is now unexpectedly the new 17th president of the United States, where he had not run to be president at all. He had not prepared for that, and in many ways, he was also at a disadvantage because the war had just ended, and Lincoln himself had not really shared entirely what his plans were for reconstruction of the nation after the war had come to a close. And now, both Congress and Johnson were going to have to figure this out without Lincoln there to explain it to them. So Johnson the very quickly, as soon as he takes office, he makes it plain and stated what his goals for Reconstruction are. He wants a quick restoration of the Union. He wants a very quick Reconstruction. He wants to quickly restore the Southern states back into it. So along these lines, Johnson made sure to grant amnesty to former Confederates, and he allowed rebel states to elect new governments. Unfortunately, Johnson did not put any kind of guidelines or restrictions on what these governments had, or any kind of pre-existing conditions that these new governments would have to meet in order for that state to be readmitted into the Union. And because of that, the new Southern state governments rapidly enacted what we now call the Black Codes, which were designed to restrict and control the newly freed slave population. It was basically slavery in everything but name. It was basically to keep the black African Americans down so that the white Southerners could still remain at the top of the political power scale. Now, unfortunately, this did not go over well with Congress at all, who very much saw what was going on and kind of pointed it out to Johnson on multiple occasions and kind of said, "What are you doing? Why are we granting amnesty to every former Confederate? Why are you just letting these Southern states elect these new governments and doing nothing to protect the newly freed slaves that are now guaranteed to be free with the end of slavery? Why are you doing nothing to protect them?" And I mean, you got to keep in mind here, Johnson is a Southerner. Johnson was not going to, I think, ever go harshly on the South because he was one of them, and he thus had very similar views. He may have opposed them in the war, but he was not going to go out on a limb and severely punish the South because he was part of that culture, and he had some of the same views on African Americans as any of them had. I mean, you had the 13th Amendment was already passed and well on its way to being ratified, which was the abolishment of slavery, and Congress at this point is debating the need for a 14th Amendment in late 1865, which will guarantee and grant African American citizenship. And so Congress, or the radical Republicans specifically in Congress, they're very much wanting to punish the South and readmit the states with pre-existing conditions. We're not just going to, war's over, come back and join us. No, they argue you started a 4-year-long war. You're going to we're going to get punished in some way. You started this. You had no authority, no legal way of doing this. You were told that. You brought armed insurrection upon the government. That obviously has not worked out well for you, and it never will again. So you're going to be punished in some way. And Congress, very much, I mean, you got to keep in mind, they have been just affected by the war as the presidency had been. To quote one Johnson quote from that time, where Johnson was questioned as to why he was not protecting the newly freed slaves, Johnson said the following: "Damn the N-word." So, damn the African Americans, as we'll put it. Damn the African Americans. I'm fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters. Johnson, I think that might have actually been during the war, but Johnson had made it clear in that statement he couldn't give a flying fig what happened to the African Americans after the war. He couldn't care if they went back to slavery, he couldn't care if they were freed or whatever. He was racist toward them because he was a Southerner. It was just part of the attitude at the time. He saw it as, I'm not going after for them. I'm going after these traitorous rebel rich people that thought they could just break away and form their own country illegally. When Congress ended up reconvening in December of 1865, it refused to seat the newly elected Southern members. They argued that Johnson was being far too lenient in his Reconstruction approach, and they ended up taking charge of Reconstruction from that point on, from December of 1865 until 1877. So very quickly, Johnson loses his opportunity to kind of be the main person in control and at the head of the Reconstruction effort of the nation, and Congress kind of takes that away from him because they argue you're being way too lenient than what you should be. In 1866, Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill, which aimed to protect African Americans. Both of these vetoes ended up being overridden by Congress. Congress then passed the 14th Amendment, which would grant black citizenship, and it made a condition that the Southern states would have to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted. This came in July of 1868. So, very quickly, upon Congress taking control, Johnson makes it more than clear he's opposed to anything that Congress tries to do for Reconstruction. So, Congress tries to set up the Freedmen's Bureau to try to provide newly freed slaves with an education, which had always been forbidden under the slave codes. And they also passed the Civil Rights Bill to kind of give African Americans some form of civil rights, at least until citizenship could be granted through a proposed 14th Amendment. And Johnson, on both of these bills, ends up vetoing them both because he doesn't view African Americans very positively at all. He's a racist man, and thus he very much vetoes against what he believes isn't correct. And in both cases, he got beat because Congress overrode both bills. It got overridden by 2/3 vote in each chamber. And that actually, I think, leads to the one picture that we have here, or two of them. Yeah. So we have two political cartoons that here. This one is actually during the 1864 presidential campaign, where it's kind of advertising, Lincoln being his history as a rail splitter and Andrew Johnson being a tailor. We're going to somehow stitch the fractured nation back together. Unfortunately, Lincoln would not be in the picture that much longer because he would end up being killed. And it would be to Johnson right there who was trying to stitch up the country to end up solving it. The one here is related to what we just discussed, where this came out, I believe, in Harper's Weekly, the same about a week after Johnson had vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill that would have established that, where he's kicking this box that's labeled Freedmen's Bureau, and all the African Americans are just going flying out of it because basically Johnson's kicking them down the stairs because he don't care. Johnson was opposed to the 14th Amendment granting African American citizenship, and he encouraged the southern states to refuse to ratify the new 14th Amendment. But it's pretty hard when, at this point, those southern states aren't getting all the federal assistance they need because they're not technically counted as a part of the Union by the government. They're suffering under military occupation in most cases. So the southern states really didn't have that much of a choice, and they said, you know what, if it gets us back in the Union, so be it. Johnson ended up, in response, going on what he called the Swing Around the Circle campaign during the 1866 congressional elections that would drum up support for his policies. Now, unfortunately for Johnson, this ended up being an absolute failure. It did not drum up support for his Reconstruction policies. In fact, it only got the Republican majorities in Congress even larger and enlarged them to the point that Johnson absolutely was not going to be able to do anything anymore without working with Congress. And I think that is part of what we're going to see here with the problems with Johnson is Johnson and Congress would increase their hostilities almost during his entire presidency up until 1868, which would culminate when he ended up being impeached. But we'll get to that here in just a second. The thing I want to kind of draw the attention to is Johnson's main problem it isn't even necessarily that he's entirely racist. It isn't even necessarily that he's a Southerner. The problem was, I mean, the racism was definitely a big issue, but in terms of the Southerner, no. The other big issue that was here with Johnson is very much a president who was a gung ho kind of guy. He thought, I can go at this any way I want, my way or no way, and that's going to be a law. It's going to work like that. Presidents throughout American history have often found out, and many times the hard way, that whether they like it or not, you have to compromise with Congress at times. You cannot, 100% of the time, go at it on your own. Because when presidents tend to do this, they don't win. They very rarely win in these situations because you got to remember Congress, as corrupt and everything else that might be, as much as the president might be, you got to keep in mind they are also supposedly elected by the people, and congressional members also have power from their people that elected them, and they're going to do what they're going to do. So you also have to keep in mind, since they represent people just as much as you do, you have to work with them. And presidents who have not done that, they don't do so hot. Johnson did not. Johnson, as we're seeing, he struggled with Congress. He vetoed two bills because it didn't go his way. He was too lenient with the South, so Congress took away his authority over Reconstruction. And now eventually they impeach him over another law that he ends up breaking that they had passed and he had tried to defy. And we see that some, I think, with modern presidents as well, where we have, I'm just going to use the last two as an example. Donald Trump, regardless of your opinions of the man, Donald Trump's one of his biggest issues was he had this gung-ho attitude where he just thought, I can do it my way, no way, there's no negotiating, they'll eventually cave to me. That is not what you gotta go in there with. You have to be willing to compromise. You could even say that with Joe Biden now. Joe Biden right now, he is, I think, in denial of the factor that he does have a significant portion of Congress that's against him and is not going to be willing to work with him unless he makes concessions. You cannot be president and ignore Congress. It does not work. You have to work with them. And we see that with Johnson, and we'll see it again, I'm sure, in some other president. I'm just using the two recent ones as an example as to why they also had some issues. But Johnson is definitely a prime example as to what happens when you stubbornly refuse to do that at all. So in February of 1868, Johnson ends up becoming the first president to be impeached. He ended up getting 11 charges against him for violating the Tenure of Office Act, which had been passed by Congress. And the Tenure of Office Act had kind of been an attempt to rein in the presidency a little bit. And you could have even argued, I think it might have even been a little bit unconstitutional on Congress's part. So I'm not going to entirely blame Johnson for breaking this law. But what the Tenure of Office Act did is basically it made it basically illegal for the president to fire or get rid of one of his cabinet members without the consent of Congress. Now, the president chooses his cabinet, but Congress does approve them. But I don't really think that same thing should apply if the president removes the cabinet members. And I don't even know if that's how it works now. But this was something that Congress had passed to kind of rein in Johnson a little bit because they had allies among his cabinet members that were very loyal to Congress's view of Reconstruction over Johnson's. And since Johnson had inherited Lincoln's cabinet members, most of them were Republican, where he was a Democrat. And one of those prominent cabinet members had been Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And Stanton had been opposing him on Reconstruction for quite some time, and Johnson had just gotten fed up with Stanton to the point that he decided, I don't care about this law that's in place, I'm getting rid of you, get out. He fires the man, and in response, Congress impeaches him for breaking the law. He is the first president in United States history to be impeached, and one out of only 3 to have been impeached, the other 2 being Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. So Johnson ends up going after 3 months of trial. So the trial begins in March, I believe. Yes, I believe the trial started in March. I mean, he was officially impeached in February, but they had some time before the trial actually began. And in March of 1868 through May of 1868, the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson is going through. And in May of 1868, the verdict from the Senate was in. And the final vote on Johnson was, in order to convict him, they were short 1 vote to convict him of removal of high crimes and misdemeanors. Had Johnson gotten just 1 more senator in the United States Senate, because mind you, the House issues the impeachment charges, but the trial's held in the Senate. Had he gotten just 1 more senator to go against him, Johnson would have also been the first and to the state only president to have been removed from office by a vote of impeachment. That's how close Johnson came. He has come. Johnson might have been the first president to be impeached, yes, and there might have been two others that have, but none of the two others came anywhere near that close to being removed from office. Johnson came one vote short of getting his butt kicked out of that office. He is the closest any president has come to getting removed, short of removal. There is no closer than one. And supposedly the only reason why the trial vote was only one vote short to convict was supposedly to preserve the integrity of the presidency, but the other reason might have also been that the Senate pro temp, would have been was a certain senator from Ohio who was not a very favorable. He was a Republican, yes, but he was also a supporter of certain issues that weren't popular at the time, such as women's suffrage. And there were a lot of Republicans who were not any more happy with the prospect that if we get rid of Johnson, this guy becomes president. And they kind of said, no, let's just leave him in there. I mean, he's going to be leaving office within a year anyway, so just let him finish his term. I think he's learned at this point. And it did. Johnson, after his impeachment trial, very much had kind of shut up. He didn't argue with Congress that much. He knew he had been beaten and embarrassed, and he didn't try anything after that point to try to impede Congress's congressional view of Reconstruction. In the 1868 presidential elections, he had hoped that the Democrats would end up nominating him, but they instead went for former New York Governor Horatio Seymour, and in that November of 1868, Seymour ended up losing the election to the Republican nominee, which was none other than former Union General and Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant. So in March of 1869, on March 4th, 1869, Johnson ended up leaving office, and he is no longer president. And this right here is two things that kind of coincide with that period of Johnson's presidency. This being not even a portrait, but a drawing of the moment when the House Master of Arms and Sergeant at Arms ended up coming into Johnson's office and delivering his summons to his impeachment trial to him in the White House. And the other one here, kind of funny, is another political cartoon of the time where this was done as Johnson's leaving office in March of 1869. And it's showing Johnson kind of dressed up like a king, and he's crying and basically saying that, oh, they just never understood my greatness. Well, who does that also sound like nowadays? But it's kind of ironic that the similarities are right there. So in March 4th, 1869, Johnson ends up leaving office. Ulysses S. Grant is now president, and Johnson goes back home to invest in public service in Tennessee. He never gives up his drive for a political career. Johnson stays in politics until his death. He's very kind of a little bit odd about some politicians for that time, as a lot of them would eventually retire. Johnson never retired. He was a politician until the day he died. So he returns home to Tennessee, and in later 1869, he did run unsuccessfully for a U.S. Senate seat for Tennessee, but he didn't get it. And then in 1872, he ended up losing a U.S. House bid that he had made for the House of Representatives. So after his presidency, Johnson came with a little bit of political baggage, and I think that very much hurt him in terms of him wanting to re-enter Congress and get elected, because people brought up his presidential record. The fact that he had been impeached, I'm sure certainly did not weigh very lightly on a lot of people's minds, considering the fact that he had been the only president to have been impeached. And Johnson did not give up, surprisingly. He did persist at this, and finally, in 1875, he did win a Senate seat for Tennessee in that year's election in 1875. He is actually the only ex-president to ever accomplish this feat. And Johnson, unfortunately for him, had barely begun his Senate term, which was in January of 1875, when he ended up dying of a stroke while on visit to a friend's on January 31st of 1875 in Carter County, Tennessee. So on January 31st of 1875, barely after he started his term as a senator, and Johnson ends up dying of a stroke on January 31st of that year. And this is a picture of Johnson that was taken during that month, just a couple weeks before he died. This is dated 1875. So this is close to what he would have looked like at his death. He pretty much looks the same, I think, but he definitely, his hair has gotten white at that point. So yeah, that kind of concludes Andrew Johnson. Of course, Andrew Johnson, definitely not one of the best presidents. I wouldn't say that Johnson is horrible on the terms of James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce and some other individuals, but he's definitely one of the lowest ranking presidents we have on there. And thank goodness, I think after him, we're actually, for any presidents that we do here in the upcoming, I mean, it ain't going to be immediate, but once we get back into them, I think we're going to be hitting some ones that aren't so horrible. So that concludes for today's video. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, anything like that, be sure to leave that in the comment section down below. I'll be sure to look through them and try to answer them if I can. If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave that as well. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. So again, reminder that next week we are not going to have a video on this channel. I've decided we're just going to take a break for Christmas for a week, let everything kind of play out, and then right after Christmas we'll be back and we'll have a new video out, which I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to be looking at for that. So until then, this I think is, yep, this is farewell until then, until after Christmas. So hopefully everyone has a very Merry Christmas, has a happy holiday, and we'll all see you back here after Christmas for the next video, and we'll be in before the new year. So until then, happy holidays.